Good afternoon, dear colleagues. The topic of my course paper is cognitive load theory and its application in the classroom. Throughout history, teaching has revised its methods in compliance with the discourse concerning instructional design. However, since the last 2 decades of the 20th century, researchers have become increasingly interested in the links between cognition and education, leading to a number of new theories which take into account the architecture of human consciousness and the mechanics of memory. One of the best-known theories is the cognitive load theory developed by John Swaller in 80s. The principles of instructional design incorporated in the work of cognitive load theory suggest a higher possibility of successful student learning by adapting elements of instruction at different stages to the knowledge of how memorization occurs. The main aim of cognitive load theory is to develop new instructional methods that are more effective than traditional ones by taking into account the shortcomings of the traditional average instructional design and human memory principles. Learning is one of the core elements of the study process. Learning is defined as a process that brings together personal and environmental experiences and influences for acquiring, enriching, or modifying one's knowledge, skills, values, attitudes, behavior, and worldviews. A variety of theories emphasize different influences on the learning process itself, such as emotional, cognitive, environmental factors, previous experience, physiological and psychological characteristics of the individual. The scientific study of learning began in the early 20th century and has developed rapidly up to the present day. There are many theories, some of them split into separate branches. However, a few of the most influential concepts stand out. The idea behind behaviorism is that learning is accomplished through placing the individual in the right conditions. Behavior for devotees of this movement is a result of experience, which implies that anyone under the right conditions can learn absolutely any skill. The external stimuli through which this effect is achieved can be manipulated, described, observed, and evaluated. According to cognitive theories, learning can be described as the complex psychological phenomena such as motivation, schemas, and cognitive processes for learning. Learning takes place in stages with increasing complexity of tasks. It as there is a kind of sequence. Students in cognitive theory are seen as processors of information which they passively perceive, perform cognitive operations on, and place into short-term and long-term memory. From a socio-cultural perspective, learning is seen as interactions between the individual and the situations. Knowledge is considered as situated and is a product of the activity, context, and culture in which it is formed and utilized. In other words, learning is not just passive consumption of information, but also active participation and negotiating social relationships. In practical implications, in language learning, this translates into various activities involving social interaction, imitation, etc. In 1988, John Swaller published his research paper presented the theory in the scientific journal Cognitive Science. The essence of Swaller's theory is that our working memory is only able to hold a small amount of information at any one time, and that instructional methods should avoid overloading it in order to maximize learning. In other words, cognitive load relates to the volume of new information that the human mind is able to process and place in memory. According to the theory, the amount of this information is quite small because memory has limitations. Instructional frameworks must consider the limitations of human memory when planning the learning process. The result of the correct distribution of the cognitive load is the presentation of a new information at the speed and level of difficulty acceptable to students to remember and comprehend. Cognitive load theory is based on a view of human information processing developed by Richard Atkinson and Richard Schifrin. This widely accepted model describes cognitive processes in three stages, in which three different types of memory are involved: sensory memory, working memory, long term memory. Sensory memory is responsible for the initial perception of information, sensory information that surrounds everyone every day in huge quantities. It is at this stage that human memory filters out the vast majority of information that comes to it. However, the information recognized by the memory as important is retained long enough to make it through to the next stage. The work of the next stage, working memory, is the main focus of the cognitive load theory. When information is made available to the working theory, it is either discarded or recycled. The main difference from the previous stage is that the amount of information in the working memory is able to hold is reduced from 5 to 9 nodes of information at a time. The knowledge is the basis of cognitive load theory. The information is then categorized and dispatched straight to long-term memory. Already processed information is stored in the structures called schemas. A schema is an organized aggregation of information according to the way it is used by its bearer. The principle of schema works both for theoretical knowledge and for practical skills like kicking a ball, etc. Working memory is seen as short-term and finite, while long-term memory is infinite. The goal of learning should be to transfer knowledge to long-term memory. If the load exceeds the information processing capacity of our memory, then this circumstance makes it difficult for the students to perform the tasks assigned in the educational process. There are three types of cognitive load. The first type of cognitive load is intrinsic. The intrinsic load is created by the basic structure of the learning material that the student is required to master in order to achieve the learning objective. The intrinsic load refers specifically to the complexity of a particular topic with its fundamentality without reference to the methods of teaching it. The intrinsic nature of this type of workload makes it impossible to get rid of it. The intrinsic cognitive load is generated precisely by the number of interacting elements and processes being processed simultaneously. The second type of cognitive load is extraneous. The extraneous cognitive load is not created by the complexity of the material itself, but by the way the teacher presents the information, the activities that the student is obliged to engage in according to the instructional planning. Some common types of the instructional design require the learning to use cognitive resources that are not related to the task itself and are not useful for performing the task. For example, searching for on the fly for information in order to do the task. In this case, the resource is spent searching for and processing information, leaving very little room for the task itself. The task of reducing external cognitive load is solved by selecting effective strategies for presenting information and instructional design in general. The third type of cognitive load is germane. Uh, Unlike the types of cognitive load discussed earlier, German cognitive load does not harm information processing but contributes to the acquisition of the new skills and other information. This type of cognitive load occurs when brain creates a learning process in order to digest new knowledge and apply it to problem solving. The result is a conceptualization of an idea and object which is stored in long-term memory and later successfully applied to other areas of knowledge. Strategies to reduce intrinsic cognitive load. The intrinsic cognitive load is created by the complexity of the material itself, so it can be resolved by working with the material accordingly. First of all, the intrinsic cognitive load is caused by the interactivity of the elements of the whole. It has the need to process several elements simultaneously in working memory. The challenge of instructional design is therefore to find a balance between the number of elements to be processed and the preservation of the integrity of the material. Based on this, it can be concluded that the internal cognitive load can be reduced by dividing a material into parts, adapting it to the student's level of prior experience. Strategies to reduce extraneous cognitive load. Extraneous load is created when the format of instruction is inefficient. In other words, it is related to exactly how the material is taught, what methods and tools are used. For example, the most common cause of the cognitive overload is either the unreasonable interactivity of the material in its aids, or the multiplicity of instructional procedures that are not related to the formation of a schema in long-term memory and its practicing. The manner in which instructions are provided can assist in reducing extraneous cognitive load. The meaning of new information is made by referring to pre-existing schema or mental models, because unclear instructions place an extraneous load on working memory. Too much effort is spent problem solving the instructions rather than forming new schema. Practical strategies to implement in the classroom. Use word examples. This strategy comes from the principles of cognitive load theory, and this is due to the observation of the effect of the same name, the worked example effect. In this context, a worked example is an example of a problem already solved step by step, where each step is explained and clearly shown. The worked example effect occurs when students who have used pre-solved problems in presenting a new topic perform better than those who have performed the problem-solving task. Worked examples are much more in fact effective in schemas, because the new material and its application have already been processed in step-by-step form. Consequently, the working memory does not need to process a large amount of information. It is easier to store a ready-made plan of action and arrange it in a schema than can be used to solve similar problems in the future. In this case, the cognitive load is reduced not only during the learning of new material, but also later on when brain relies on the already existing schema provided by the worked example. Thus, working memory expands slightly less cognitive effort to solve problems when using a schema that already exists. This approach is particularly effective for beginners who expend a lot of cognitive resources to master a topic, which contributes to cognitive overload. In English teaching, worked examples are particularly effective in learning grammatical structures such as grammatical tenses, different types of sentences, word order in sentences, in general, all topics that require learning a lot of information to understand how rules work. And any complex task can be step by step described by the teacher so that students understand how a particular task can be successfully solved. For example, when preparing a student for international language exams such as IELTS, TOEFL, it is effective to work through the algorithms of solving various tasks, and the worked examples are the best way to accomplish the task. The second practical strategy when presenting information will be to tailor the lessons accordingly to the already existing body of knowledge and skills. Human brains can only handle a little quantity of new information at a time, but they can analyze extremely huge volumes of previously stored information. As a consequence, using knowledge already stored in students' long-term memory can assist in lessening cognitive load and hence result in a more effective learning. Teachers can maximize student learning by relying on students' prior knowledge and limiting the quantity of new information the students must digest at once. Teachers should consider two things. Number one, the number of items that need to be processed at the same time to get a grasp of the topic. The student's previous knowledge, the teacher should make sure that the students have background knowledge by means of a test or exercise or do a brief review of the topic and only then proceed. For example, let us take the study of one of the complex grammatical structures of the English language, such as conditional sentence. As we know, each of the existing four types involves the simultaneous use of several grammatical tenses, which, depending on the grammatical context, can change the meaning of the whole sentence. Therefore, before presenting the topic of conditional sentences to students at any level, the teacher should make sure that the students have background knowledge, knowing grammatical tenses and their application. Consider the example of students with low and higher level of knowledge in the area. Cognitive load theory argues that at the initial stages of learning, it is more effective to use already developed examples so the students can see a ready solution to a problem and do not overload their working channels with poor learned information. Those instructional designs that are effective at one level of proficiency may not be effective at a higher level, and vice versa. Strategy number three is to gradually increase the number of activities aimed at independent problem solving as students progress. As students become more knowledgeable about the material, the strategy of using work examples diminishes in effectiveness, and the optimal solution is to gradually extend the opportunities for self-directed problem solving as students become more adept at solving problems of a certain type. Providing opportunities for independent study is also a necessary measure to prevent experienced students from trying to match a teacher's instructions with what they already know, increasing the cognitive load and distracting them from the task at the hand. The goal of providing more opportunities for learners to solve the problems independently can be implemented in the classroom using several strategies, all of which are linked to the use of worked examples. Firstly, the teacher may omit some steps from the example already worked out in order for the students to fill in the gaps themselves. And a second way to implement this in practice is to gradually give out less elaborate examples. For example, take the aforementioned preparation for international language examinations. As a student's skill in this field of study increase, it is reasonable to give less and less suggestions over time as the student completes the tasks in the sample exam. Strategy number four is to cut out unnecessary information. Students are unable to learn productively when their attention is focused on processing irrelevant information. Insubstantial information includes pieces of information that our students are already aware of, supplementary information that is not specifically linked to the lesson, or the same information given in multiple forms. In English language teaching, the problem of an overabundance of additional information is very common. In particular, the problem manifests itself in insufficiently sought out supplementary materials for the lesson. For example, slides and PowerPoint presentations are often used as a supplement, and a very common mistake is the abundance of the material or written text on the slide and the teacher duplicating it. As mentioned earlier, this approach stresses several channels of information at once, causing the unnecessary cognitive load. The optimal solution to this problem may be several ways at once: placing basic information of the slides in quantities that can be handled, reducing the abundance of distracting elements such as pictures used to attract attention but which are irrelevant to the material of the lesson. Do not comment on information that can be understood without being spoken about, for example, data from graphs, charts, etc. Put it differently, redundant information should be eliminated in order to prevent an increase of the extraneous cognitive load. The next strategy, which stems from the principles of cognitive load theory, is to present all the relevant information altogether. In this context of cognitive load theory, each source is important for a holistic understanding of the topic, whereas otherwise the student expends unnecessary cognitive effort in order to link information from different sources into a coherent picture. Material should be presented in the way that the disparate sources of information are physically and temporally integrated, thus eliminating the need for students to mentally integrate information. Information can be fragmented both in time and space. For example, the split attention effect occurs when the English teacher, while explaining a new grammar topic, does not give a worked example immediately, but after some time has passed, when the students have already had the time to shift their attention to other things. Consequently, when planning the instructional design of a lesson, timing should be taken into account in order to avoid the occurrence of the effect. Also, not taking into account the problem of split attention is a common problem in English language textbook. Assignments that require the collation of material from different pages are unfortunate from this point of view. For example, text reading tasks and corresponding post-reading activities are often located on different pages of the textbook, and as a result, the student has to expend unnecessary cognitive effort in turning the pages, rereading the material each time, which increases the cognitive load and consequently reduces the effectiveness of the learning process. To avoid such a problem, instructional design should be structured to ensure that materials for similar tasks are located in the single area visible to a student. Conclusion: all of the stages described above contribute to a proper distribution of the cognitive load in the instructional design, which results in the presentation of new information at a speed and level of complexity acceptable to learners to remember and comprehend. When the strategies are applied successfully, the cognitive load decreases, freeing up space in working memory for more efficient learning.